The restaurant glowed with the warm golden light of chandeliers, their soft shimmer bouncing off polished cutlery and crystal glasses that chimed faintly whenever waiters passed by. Captain Elena Torres sat at the far corner table, her posture more relaxed than usual, her olive green uniform traded for a simple black dress that clung elegantly to her athletic frame. For once, she wasn't scanning the exits or keeping her hand near the concealed holster she never admitted carrying even off base. Tonight, she had promised herself, was just dinner. A rare evening when she could laugh with her friends, sip wine without worrying about reports piling up on her desk, and remember what it felt like to be a woman and not just an officer in a world that rarely allowed her to rest. The voices around her blurred into a gentle hum, plates clattering, corks popping, conversations weaving into the background like a half-forgotten symphony. Across from her, Lieutenant Mara Reeves gestured animatedly with her fork, retelling some absurd story about a supply sergeant who had accidentally ordered 6 crates of toilet brushes instead of rifles. Elena laughed, the sound surprising even herself because it felt unburdened, clean and unforced. That laugh reminded her of the cadet she had been years ago, before duty had wrapped around her shoulders like a second skin. She let herself sink into the moment, fingers curling lightly around her wineglass as she glanced at the window beside her, where city lights painted streaks of gold and red across the glass. She didn't notice him enter at first. The restaurant door creaked faintly, a gust of cooler night air following in someone tall, broad-shouldered, and deliberate in his step. She only realized the shift when Mara's words faltered, the lieutenant's gaze flicking to a figure moving through the tables with the gravity of someone used to being obeyed before he even spoke. Colonel Marcus Hale. His reputation preceded him. Decorated, calculating, the kind of officer who carried secrets in the lines carved deep into his weathered face. Elena's eyes widened despite herself, because he wasn't supposed to be here. She had seen his name stamped across mission files, his clipped voice in briefing rooms, but never in the low candlelight of a civilian restaurant. He approached without hesitation, his gaze locked on her like a missile's trajectory, though outwardly calm, even polite. Mara shifted awkwardly in her chair, muttering an excuse before rising, leaving her half-eaten meal behind. It was as if the entire restaurant adjusted to his presence, the chatter softening, the waiters stepping aside, and Elena felt her heartbeat notch higher in her chest. She straightened instinctively, posture snapping into the unconscious discipline drilled into her, even though she was off duty, even though this was supposed to be her night. "Captain Torres," he greeted, his voice a low rumble that didn't need to carry far to command attention. He didn't sit until she gave the smallest nod, and even then he lowered himself into the chair across from her with the air of someone who already owned the space. She forced her shoulders to loosen, drawing in a slow breath. "Colonel," she replied, her tone measured, careful, as though she were navigating a minefield. "This is unexpected." A faint smirk touched the corner of his mouth, but his eyes remained serious, as though carved from stone. He glanced briefly at her glass of wine, then back at her, and for a moment she felt as though she were under inspection. Yet there was something else there, an undercurrent she couldn't place, something that prickled the back of her neck like the warning of an incoming storm. He leaned forward slightly, the candle between them throwing shadows across his sharp features, and she realized her pulse had quickened not just from surprise but from anticipation. "I wouldn't intrude on your evening if it weren't important," he said, his words measured, precise. She tilted her head, feigning nonchalance, though her hand tightened on her glass. She had been trained to read tone, and his was one of controlled urgency. This wasn't social. It wasn't casual. Whatever had brought him here cut through the boundaries of rank and the walls she had tried to build around her private life. She set the glass down carefully, the faint clink louder than it should have been. "Understood, sir. But perhaps we can," she began, her voice steady, when he leaned closer across the table. The distance between them collapsed, his shadow falling across her dress, his words barely more than a whisper, but sharp enough to pierce through the soft murmur of the restaurant. 4 words. Just 4 words, but they landed like a detonation in her chest. Her breath caught. The edges of the room seemed to blur, the sound of laughter and cutlery fading until all that existed was his steady gaze and the echo of those words repeating in her head. The mission she thought had been over, the assignment she had believed buried, the promise she had made to herself about never being pulled back in, it all shattered in an instant. Dinner was over. Her night of peace was over. And Elena Torres knew, as her pulse thundered in her ears, that nothing about her life would remain the same. The words echoed in her skull like a ricochet, unstoppable, relentless. 4 syllables that seemed so simple, yet they stripped the world bare around her. Elena Torres blinked once, forcing her breath into something steady, though her heart had already leapt into an erratic rhythm. She had sat across from generals before, faced combat under fire, stared at men twice her size in interrogation rooms and never flinched. But those 4 words had struck deeper than any bullet. She swallowed hard, her gaze tightening on the colonel's face, searching for some hint of softness, some flicker of doubt. There was none. His eyes were steady, dark, unwavering, the kind of stare forged by men who made choices that carried the weight of lives and nations. Around them, the restaurant carried on as though nothing had changed. A waiter set down a steaming dish on a nearby table, couples laughed, a child fussed quietly near the entrance. It was surreal the way the world spun so normally when her own axis had just shifted. Elena straightened her back, pulling the mask of composure back into place, though she felt it cracking under the weight of what she now carried. She leaned slightly forward, lowering her voice so that only he could hear. "You can't mean that. Not here. Not now." Colonel Hale's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. Those 4 words weren't the kind you said twice. He lifted his water glass instead, taking a slow sip, as if granting her a moment to absorb the shock. When he set it back down, the candlelight caught the scar along his jawline, a detail she had noticed before but never given thought to. Now it seemed emblematic of the man himself, calculated, hardened, cut deep but unbroken. Elena's fingers curled into her lap, nails digging faint crescents into her skin. She forced herself to draw a long breath, exhaling slowly through her nose. She had promised herself she was done. The mission file had been sealed, her involvement buried. She had survived the aftermath with her sanity intact only by believing it was over. But now, with those 4 words, he had dragged her back into the vortex she had spent months clawing her way out of. "You don't understand what you're asking," she murmured, the edges of her voice sharp, though she kept it quiet enough not to draw attention. Hale leaned closer, his presence commanding but not threatening. It wasn't force that pressed her, but inevitability, like the tide erasing footprints on a shore. "I understand better than anyone," he countered softly. "And I wouldn't be here if I had another option." The flicker of something raw passed across his expression. Fatigue, perhaps, or desperation. But it was gone as quickly as it came, swallowed by the mask of command. Elena caught it, though, and it unsettled her more than the order itself. Colonels didn't whisper 4 words in dimly lit restaurants unless they were standing on the edge of collapse. If he had come to her, of all people, it meant one truth: they were already out of time. Her mind raced, cataloging possibilities, outcomes, the invisible web of consequences. If she obeyed, she was dragged back into a shadow she had sworn to leave behind. If she refused, she risked something far greater, because Hale wouldn't have come unless the stakes were catastrophic. And yet, in the midst of that storm of calculation, she felt a pang of something she hadn't anticipated. A pull toward him, not as an officer, not as a superior, but as a man sitting across from her with the weight of the world etched into his shoulders. She hated herself for noticing it, the way the candlelight softened the stern planes of his face, the low rumble of his voice that seemed to settle under her skin, the gravity of his presence that felt less like pressure and more like inevitability. Attraction was dangerous. Attraction could kill. She shifted slightly in her chair, as if the movement could dislodge the thought before it rooted any deeper. But it lingered, stubborn, a whisper under her skin that matched the 4 words he had spoken. "You put this in front of me knowing I can't refuse," she said finally, her tone steady but her chest tight. He gave a slight nod, the faintest acknowledgement that her words were true. For a moment, neither of them moved, the silence between them heavy, electric. Then Hale's hand shifted, not toward her but toward the small folder he had tucked discreetly beneath his arm. He slid it across the table, barely visible in the shadows. Elena stared at it, the thin manila cover like a ghost from her past. She didn't reach for it. Not yet. Her hand hovered just above the table, trembling with the weight of choice. She had wanted one evening. One dinner without duty. But duty, it seemed, had come to her anyway, wrapped in the form of a colonel with a scarred jawline and 4 whispered words that she would never unhear. And as her fingers finally touched the folder, as her pulse drummed louder than the restaurant's quiet music, Elena Torres knew that she had crossed a line. There was no going back. The folder felt heavier than its slim frame should allow, its edges pressing coldly against her fingertips as she drew it closer. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she watched the colonel, her eyes narrowing, searching his face for some clue of what lay inside. He gave nothing away. Years of command had turned his expression into stone, but beneath the rigidity she thought she saw a flicker of urgency, something like the twitch of a fuse burning too close to detonation. She slid a finger under the flap and pulled it open, careful, deliberate, as if peeling away the lid of Pandora's box. Inside, several photographs lay stacked, black and white surveillance images grainy under the candlelight. Her eyes caught on the first one, a blurred figure on a rooftop, the silhouette sharp against a night sky she recognized too well. A tremor of recognition ran through her, her breath catching at the familiarity of the scene. She flipped to the next image, a convoy, desert dust curling behind armored trucks. Then another, an aerial shot of a warehouse marked with a red circle. And then the fourth photo stopped her cold. A face. Grainy, partially shadowed, but undeniable. She hadn't seen it in years, and yet it felt as if it had never left her. Her stomach lurched, her throat constricting around the unspoken name. She pressed the image flat against the table, her hands splayed as though pinning it in place, keeping it from leaping into her chest like a dagger. Slowly she lifted her eyes to meet Hale's. "This isn't possible," she whispered. The words felt brittle, as though they might shatter between her lips. "It's more than possible," he replied, his tone quiet but firm. "It's happening." Her mind flooded with memories she had forced herself to bury. The night ambush that had left half her unit dead, the intelligence report that had promised the man in the photo was gone, erased. She had mourned him, not as a friend but as an enemy too dangerous to ever rise again. To see his face now, alive, moving, planning, was to have the ground ripped out beneath her. She dropped her gaze to the file again, scanning the notes scribbled in Hale's tight handwriting. Phrases leapt out: arms shipment confirmed, civilian casualties projected, rogue network mobilizing. Each line pressed a little harder into her chest. This wasn't just another mission. It was the one she had thought was buried with the ghosts of her past. "Why me?" she asked finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "You have a dozen teams more qualified, more detached." Hale studied her for a long moment before answering. His eyes didn't waver. "Because you're the only one who's faced him and lived." The words lodged in her throat like a blade. She hated that he was right. She hated that she was the one who had the map of this man's methods etched into her bones. And she hated, most of all, the way Hale's voice carried something beyond strategy, something personal, as if he knew the weight he was placing on her shoulders and carried part of it himself. Elena pushed the file away, but the images clung to her mind like shadows. She wanted to walk out, to leave the restaurant and never look back. But she knew even as she considered it that she wouldn't. Not really. That was the cruel trick of duty, it pulled you back even when your soul begged to run. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the colonel, her chest tight with conflicting currents. He was calm, unflinching, but she saw the tension in the way his hand curled around his glass, the faint tick in his jaw. He wasn't asking her as an officer tonight. He was asking her as a man who had run out of time. Silence stretched between them, taut and electric, until Elena finally exhaled. "If I say yes, I want full command of my operation. No interference, no second-guessing." For the first time, the faintest crack of relief flickered across his face, gone almost instantly, replaced with the stone mask of authority. "Agreed," he said. "And if I say no?" she pressed, needing to hear it out loud. His eyes darkened, and for a moment he leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then we lose the war before it starts." The restaurant's warmth suddenly felt suffocating. Elena reached for her glass of wine, draining the last of it in a single swallow. Her decision had already been made the moment she touched that folder, but she needed the illusion of choice, needed to believe she still had agency in the tide that was pulling her under. She set the glass down carefully, then pushed the folder back toward him, not in refusal but in grim acceptance. Her gaze locked on his, unwavering now, her voice steel wrapped in silk. "Then I guess we don't have the luxury of no." For the first time all evening, Hale's eyes softened. It wasn't victory in his gaze nor satisfaction. It was something heavier, almost sorrowful. He inclined his head once, solemn, like a man acknowledging a vow sealed not by words but by blood. And in that dimly lit restaurant, with the hum of life carrying on around them as if nothing had shifted, Elena Torres felt the weight of the past crash into the present. She had stepped back onto the battlefield, and there was no return. The night air outside the restaurant was cool, almost sharp, a stark contrast to the suffocating warmth that had wrapped around Elena during dinner. The city lights bled across the pavement, the low hum of passing cars mingling with the distant buzz of neon. She stepped out first, clutching her coat around her, though it wasn't the cold that unsettled her. It was the knowledge that her life had shifted again, irreversibly, with the colonel's 4 whispered words. Hale followed at her shoulder, silent, his presence heavy but steady, like a shadow that refused to leave. They didn't speak until they reached his car, a sleek black government-issued sedan that looked unremarkable but hummed with quiet authority. Hale opened the rear door for her, and for a moment she hesitated, the world narrowing to that single choice. Step inside and accept the burden waiting for her, or walk away and live with the guilt of refusing. Her chest tightened, but she slid into the seat, the leather cool against her skin, the smell faintly of dust and steel. Hale closed the door after her, circling to the other side. The city blurred past as the car pulled away, its tinted windows turning the world outside into a shifting canvas of color and light. Inside, the silence stretched until Hale finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "You need to understand the scale before you commit." Elena turned her head toward him, eyes narrowing. "I committed the second you put that folder in front of me." His jaw flexed as though weighing whether to argue, but instead he reached into the briefcase resting beside him. He drew out a tablet, pressing a few commands before turning the screen toward her. Maps bloomed across it, layered with red markers, movement lines and highlighted zones. She leaned closer, her eyes scanning the details. Supply chains. Border crossings. Unmarked camps clustered along fault lines of fragile governments. Each marker wasn't just a point on a map, it was a potential flashpoint, a place where blood could spill and spread like wildfire. "This network," Hale explained, tapping one of the red markers, "has been rebuilding in silence for years. Smuggling, recruitment, infiltration. The man you saw in that photo, he's the spine of it. Without him, the structure collapses. With him, it becomes a machine that will tear through every fragile alliance we've fought to keep intact." Elena's throat tightened as she traced the arcs of movement across the map. "And you think I'm the one who can cut the spine?" "I don't think," he said, his eyes steady on her. "I know." The weight of certainty in his tone pressed against her chest. He wasn't flattering her, wasn't offering her choice dressed as command. He was laying down inevitability. And the worst part was, she knew he was right. Her history with the man in the photo wasn't just coincidence. It was the kind of knowledge that came with scars, with memory, with survival. She set the tablet down, rubbing her temples. "This isn't just a mission, is it?" Hale's silence was answer enough. His gaze lingered on her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes before he finally spoke. "No, it's not. It's the beginning of something bigger. Something that will decide which side of history we fall on." For a moment, the car was filled with only the sound of the engine's steady hum. Elena leaned back, staring at the ceiling, trying to will her heartbeat to slow. Every part of her training screamed to compartmentalize, to lock her fear in a box and focus only on the objective. But there was something about being in this confined space with him, with the echo of his voice still in her ears, that made the walls feel too close, the silence too charged. "You could have sent someone else," she said finally, turning her head toward him. Her eyes locked on his profile, strong and unyielding in the passing glow of streetlights. "Why risk coming to me yourself?" His lips tightened, but he didn't look away. "Because I needed you to understand what's at stake. And because..." His voice trailed off, the words catching, and for the first time since she'd known him, he seemed to struggle with what to say. "Because what?" she pressed, her voice quiet but edged with something she couldn't quite control. He exhaled slowly, a faint crack in his armor. "Because I knew if anyone else asked, you'd walk away." The admission lingered between them, heavier than any map or mission file. Elena's chest tightened, 1,000 responses clawing at her throat, but none found their way out. She turned her gaze back to the window, watching the blur of city lights as if they could anchor her to something real, something simple. But the truth was already settling in her bones. This wasn't just another operation. It was a return to a past she thought buried, pulled back by a man who carried the weight of command and something more. A trust, maybe even a belief that felt dangerously close to personal. And as the car carried them toward the safe house where the first briefing would unfold, Elena Torres realized with a sinking certainty that her battle was no longer just against the enemy in the photographs. It was also against the pull of the man sitting beside her. The safe house was buried at the edge of the city, a low-profile building tucked behind rows of shuttered warehouses. From the outside it looked abandoned, its windows dark, its brick walls cracked with age. But the moment Hale swiped his credentials and the heavy steel door swung open, Elena recognized the quiet hum of generators, the faint scent of oil and disinfectant, and the sterile order that betrayed its true purpose. This was no ordinary shelter. It was a nerve center built to blend into shadows while pulling the strings that shifted battle lines. Inside, the glow of monitors lit the narrow room, casting faces in shifting shades of blue. A handful of operatives straightened as Hale entered, their conversations snapping shut like doors slamming in unison. They wore civilian clothes, but the posture of soldiers never truly faded. Their backs were straight, their eyes sharp, scanning every detail. Elena felt their attention flick to her, subtle but undeniable, curiosity brimming in their silence. Few people were brought in without reason, and fewer still at the colonel's side. "This is Captain Torres," Hale said, his voice firm, carrying the weight of finality. "Effective immediately, she'll be heading the operation." The words rippled across the room like a shockwave. A tall operative with a shaved head shifted in his seat, his expression neutral but skeptical. A woman at the far console, younger but clearly sharp, raised her brows slightly. Elena felt the weight of their judgments pressing against her, but she didn't flinch. She met their gazes one by one, steady, unyielding, the way she had in every briefing where doubt had tried to worm its way in. Hale gestured to the central table where maps and files were spread in careful layers. "Bring her up to speed." As one of the analysts began outlining the enemy's movement patterns, Elena leaned over the maps, her fingers tracing the red arcs. Each route was familiar, eerily so, a mirror of past campaigns she had thought erased. Her jaw tightened. The enemy wasn't just repeating tactics. They were refining them, sharpening the old strategies into something deadlier. "They're using old channels," Elena murmured, half to herself. "Routes we burned years ago. That means they're not just rebuilding, they're baiting us, daring us to follow patterns they know we recognize." She glanced up, catching the analyst's surprised expression. "Which means there's a second network we haven't mapped yet. The real one." A silence followed, broken only when Hale nodded once, decisive. "That's why she's here." It was subtle, but Elena caught the shift. The room's tension didn't vanish, but it softened, the edge of doubt blunted by the authority in his tone and the certainty in her analysis. She straightened, folding her arms, her mind already racing with possibilities. For the first time in months, the part of her that had gone dormant stirred again. The strategist, the soldier, the captain who thrived on the razor's edge of impossible choices. Still, beneath the steel of her focus, a thread of unease coiled tight. Every word spoken, every plan unfolding, was tethered to the man standing beside her. She could feel his gaze lingering on her from time to time, not intrusive but there, steady, like a compass pointing north. It unsettled her more than the mission itself, and that realization made her chest tighten. The briefing stretched into the early hours, monitors flickering with satellite feeds, intelligence packets exchanged and dissected. Names, locations, coordinates, each one another weight on the scale tilting toward war. Finally, Hale dismissed the team, his voice clipped, leaving only Elena in the dimly lit room. She pressed her palms against the table, staring down at the sprawl of maps, her reflection faint in the glossy surface. The silence after the team's departure was deafening. She didn't look up when she spoke. "You didn't tell them why I'm really here." "They don't need to know," Hale answered. His tone was steady, but she caught the edge beneath it. Her eyes lifted, locking onto his. "They don't know what he did. They don't know what I lost. If they did, they'd question your judgment," Hale cut in, his gaze sharp. "And right now we can't afford that." The words stung because they were true. But beneath the sting was something else, anger. Not at him, not entirely, but at the way the past still shackled her. She pushed off the table, taking a step toward him, her voice low but fierce. "You put me here because of him. Because you think I'm the only one who can stop him. Fine. But don't you dare treat me like I'm a liability when I'm the only reason this mission has a chance." For a heartbeat, the air between them felt charged, almost electric. Hale's jaw tightened, but he didn't back away. He held her gaze, steady, unyielding, yet there was something flickering there, something he wasn't letting himself say. Finally, his shoulders eased a fraction. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "You're not a liability. You're the edge we need." The admission hit harder than any compliment. Elena's breath caught, though she hid it well. She stepped back, breaking the current between them, turning toward the maps again. "Then let's make sure we use it before it's too late." The words were steel, but her pulse betrayed her, racing faster than it should. Because no matter how much she buried it under discipline, one truth had already begun to take root in her. This mission wasn't just about facing the ghost of her past. It was about facing the man beside her, and the dangerous pull she could no longer ignore. The safe house had grown quiet after the team dispersed, leaving only the faint hum of generators and the ticking of an old clock mounted on the far wall. Most of the operatives had retreated to their bunks or the adjoining offices, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts in the strategy room. She lingered over the maps, her fingers tracing routes she had already memorized, eyes scanning notes that no longer needed reading. The truth was she wasn't studying anymore. She was stalling, trying to anchor herself in lines and coordinates because they felt easier than what awaited in the silence beyond. Her reflection glimmered faintly in the window, framed by city lights that seemed a world away. Out there, people dined, laughed, lived without the weight of impossible choices pressing on their shoulders. She envied them, just for a moment, before reality pressed back in with its familiar gravity. She had made her decision. She had stepped back into this life. And tomorrow before dawn she would carry it forward into the field. The sound of footsteps broke the quiet. Slow, deliberate, unmistakable. She didn't turn until Hale's reflection joined hers in the glass, his broad frame cutting a shadow into the dim light. He didn't speak at first. For a man who commanded entire operations with his voice, he seemed almost reluctant now, as if searching for words he wasn't used to saying. "You should rest," he said finally, his tone low but steady. Elena turned, leaning lightly against the edge of the table, arms folded. "So should you." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, more a brief acknowledgement. He stepped closer, his gaze flicking to the maps before settling back on her. "You're still carrying it? I can see it." She arched a brow. "Carrying what?" "The weight of the past. Of him. It's written in the way you look at those photos." His voice was matter-of-fact, but there was no judgment in it, only observation, the kind that cut sharper because it was true. Her chest tightened, but she refused to look away. "You don't get to read me that easily." His gaze held hers, unflinching. "I've seen too many soldiers try to fight two wars at once, one in the field and one in their own head. It doesn't end well." The words landed heavier than she expected. For a moment she saw not the colonel but the man behind the rank, someone who carried his own battles in silence, someone who knew the cost of fighting shadows. She looked down, her fingers brushing over the edge of the table. He wasn't just another mission. "You know that, don't you?" "Yes," Hale said simply. No denial, no deflection. Just the truth spoken aloud. Silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Elena felt the pull between them, subtle but undeniable, the kind of gravity that wasn't written into mission files or maps. She hated it and yet she couldn't ignore it. It wasn't weakness, it was human. And it scared her more than the enemy waiting on the other side of tomorrow. She pushed off the table, taking a step closer to him. Her voice dropped, quieter now, almost daring. "You dragged me back into this because you knew I wouldn't refuse. Because you trust me to finish what I started. Fine. But don't think for a second I'll let you stand there and act like you're the only one carrying ghosts." For the first time Hale's composure cracked, just slightly. His jaw tightened, his eyes darkened, and when he finally spoke, his voice was softer, almost raw. "I never thought I was." The admission caught her off guard, knocking the wind from her in a way no argument could. She searched his face and for a heartbeat she saw it, something unspoken, heavy with years of silence. The lines around his eyes, the scar along his jaw, all carved from choices that had cost him pieces of himself. He wasn't asking her to follow him into this mission. He was walking into it alongside her, carrying his ghost just as she carried hers. Her throat felt tight, her next words barely more than a whisper. "And what happens if we don't make it back?" He held her gaze, unwavering. "Then we make sure it mattered." The simplicity of it struck her harder than any reassurance could have. She should have stepped back then, should have built her walls higher, but instead she found herself rooted in place, the air between them charged, thick with everything neither of them would say. His nearness was steady, unyielding, and she realized with a sharp clarity that tomorrow's mission wasn't the only line she was about to cross. The clock ticked on, filling the silence they didn't break. Neither moved closer, but neither pulled away. And in that fragile stillness, Elena understood the danger wasn't just out there, waiting in the shadows of hostile terrain. It was here, between her and the man who had whispered 4 words that changed everything, and who, without meaning to, had already begun changing her. Dawn came without mercy. The sky was a dull slate, clouds heavy and low, the kind of morning that felt as though the world itself held its breath. Elena adjusted the straps of her vest, the weight of the gear familiar but no less suffocating. Around her, the team moved with quiet efficiency, their boots crunching against gravel as they loaded weapons, checked comms, and ran through final signals. Engines rumbled softly, their vibration humming through the floor of the safehouse garage. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and anticipation, an old bitter perfume she had sworn she'd left behind. Hale stood at the head of the vehicles, his posture as rigid as ever, but his eyes swept the team with a precision that missed nothing. He didn't need to shout. His presence alone steadied the nerves of those around him. Elena caught the way the operatives glanced his way, then at her, reading the unspoken connection between them. They didn't ask questions, but she knew they felt it. The shift in command, the shared gravity between Captain Torres and Colonel Hale. The briefing had been simple. Too simple in Elena's opinion. A warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a hub for weapons moving through the rogue network. Intercept, confirm the presence of the target, and extract before reinforcements arrived. On paper, clean. In practice, she knew better. Missions this neat always had teeth hidden beneath. She climbed into the lead vehicle, the metal cold beneath her gloves. The engine roared to life, and with it, so did the coil of tension in her gut. Hale settled beside her, silent, his eyes fixed forward. For several miles they didn't speak, the convoy rolling through empty streets as the city thinned into the industrial sprawl beyond. She stole a glance at him once, catching the faint reflection of dawn in his eyes. He looked unshakable, carved from stone, but she had learned enough to see the strain buried beneath. The warehouse came into view like a wound in the landscape, rusted steel siding, broken windows, trucks idling near the loading dock. Figures moved in and out, quick and disciplined, their silhouettes too organized for simple smugglers. Elena's pulse quickened. This wasn't a front. This was a stronghold. The convoy halted several blocks away, engines cut to silence. The team moved quickly, fanning out into positions, weapons drawn but held close. Elena crouched low behind a half-collapsed wall, her eyes scanning the compound through her scope. She counted at least a dozen guards outside, more shadows moving within. And then, her breath caught. At the edge of the loading bay, giving clipped orders to the men below, stood the face from the photograph. Grainy no longer, sharper now in the pale morning light, but no less haunting. He was older, his frame heavier, but the posture was the same tilt of the head, the same cold authority radiating from every movement. The ghost from her past was no ghost at all. He was flesh and blood, alive, commanding. Elena, Hale's voice cut softly through the comms, pulling her back. Confirm visual. Her throat tightened around the words, but she forced them out. Confirmed. It's him. Static buzzed briefly, followed by Hale's calm, measured tone. Then this is where it begins. The team moved like shadows, slipping into flanking positions as Elena and Hale advanced along the northern wall. The air was thick with dust, every breath tasting of rust and old steel. Elena's grip tightened on her rifle, the familiar weight both comforting and suffocating. Each step brought her closer to the man who had shaped her nightmares, the man whose survival had shattered everything she thought she knew. At the breach point, she froze, pressing her back against the cold metal. Hale leaned close, his voice low in her ear. We goin' fast. Secure the floor, cut off exits, take him alive if possible. She turned her head, meeting his gaze in the dim light. For a second, the mission fell away and it was just the two of them, the air between them taut with everything unspoken. She gave a single sharp nod. Understood. The signal was given. Explosives cracked against the steel door, the blast echoing across the yard. Smoke billowed, shouts erupted, and the warehouse became a storm. Elena surged forward, rifle raised, her body moving with the instinct of a soldier who had done this too many times to count. Gunfire rattled, sparks flaring as bullets tore against steel. Men shouted in languages half familiar, chaos blooming like fire across the floor. She ducked behind cover, returning fire with crisp precision, each shot carving a path deeper into the compound. Around her, the team moved with practiced coordination, sweeping the corners, cutting through resistance. Hale's voice anchored her through the comms, steady and unyielding, his commands sharp enough to slice through the din. And then, there he was. The man himself, stepping into the chaos, barking orders, his eyes scanning the storm with a predator's calm. For a heartbeat their gazes locked across the smoke and gunfire, and Elena felt the world narrow to that single line of sight. Her chest tightened, a surge of old rage and something darker rising in her veins. The past was no longer behind her. It was here, alive, staring back at her with the same cold certainty that had haunted her for years. Elena, Hale's voice cut through, sharp with urgency. Focus. She blinked, forcing her breath steady, dragging her rifle back up. The mission wasn't over. The war wasn't won. And the man in her sights wasn't just a ghost anymore. He was the target, and this time she wouldn't miss. The air inside the warehouse was a storm of smoke, fire, and gunfire. Each muzzle flash lit the shadows in violent bursts, each scream of metal against metal rattled through Elena's bones. She pushed forward through the haze, her rifle steady, the sound of her breath loud in her own ears. Around her, the team pressed the assault, methodical and relentless, but her focus had narrowed to a single point. The man at the far end of the floor, issuing orders with icy calm even as his men fell, was the axis of everything. He was the reason the mission had been staged, the reason Hale had whispered those words to her that night at dinner.